Hello, everyone. I'm so excited. I'm Emma, the communications lead at CEA, and I have the honor to introduce our speaker, Zach Robinson, who will give the opening remarks and then a brief Q&A. Zach started as CEO of CEA in February 2024. He also serves as the CEO of CEA's fiscal sponsor, Effective Ventures Foundation USA. Previously, he was the chief of staff at Open Philanthropy, where he managed communications and grant-making teams. Before his work at OpenPhil, he was the director of product and strategy for a startup and was a management consultant at Bain & Company. I just want to say that in his time at CEA so far, Zach has brought a lot of momentum and excitement and infectious enthusiasm for the future of EA that I know he'll share in his talk today. The talk will discuss tools that the EA community can use to build an enduring impact. And you can join him for office hours after the talk in room 303. So please help me welcome Zach.
Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all at EAG. As I've already been introduced, I'm going to take the moment to put the spotlight on someone else. This is Jill Biden. I think many of you in the audience probably already know who she is, but we have an international crowd at EAG. And so for those who aren't familiar, she's the First Lady of the United States, the wife of President Joe Biden. This is the First Lady at the United Nations last month, launching the Partnership for a Lead-Free Future, a collaboration between the US Agency for International Development and UNICEF to end childhood lead poisoning in low and middle income countries. Lead is a flagship EA cause, yet none of the names or institutions are traditionally associated with effective altruism. But make no mistake, EA is at the heart of this success story. USAID's press release talked explicitly about the, quote, neglectedness of a solvable, one might say tractable, issue affecting 1 in 2 children in lower and middle income countries. The First Lady would go on to make the connection more explicit. In her remarks, she had some praise for an important EA organization that contributed to the partnership. As many of you will have seen on Twitter, she said, and I quote, "Open philanthropy strikes again." Okay, so she didn't say exactly those words. And those tweets may not have actually been about Jill Biden. But she did say, and this time I do quote for real, quote, "I'm also grateful to Open Philanthropy, which has been at the forefront of the fight against lead poisoning in children for so many years," end quote. Moments like this deserve celebration. But I also think there's a risk in being captivated by big wins and famous figures. Joe Biden was on stage for about 8 minutes, and I'm grateful to her for elevating the cause. But the real story of EA's impact isn't found in 8 minutes on a UN stage. It's found in the years of patient work that made those minutes possible. EA's contributions to the Partnership for a Lead-Free Future were at least 5 years in the making. So I want to take us through a brief history of EA's role in lead elimination, because I think that the history of moments like these matter most for what they can teach us about building lasting change for an EA that endures. EA's identification of and support for lead elimination as a policy intervention dates back at least to 2019, building on foundational work many others did outside of the EA ecosystem. In 2019, Give Well Give grant to IPEN, the International Pollutants Elimination Network, to fund campaigns in Southeast Asia aimed at regulating lead paint. Later, in 2022, Give Well would partner with EA funds and Open Philanthropy to fund Pure Earth, an organization dedicated to reducing lead pollution in lower and middle income countries. Elsewhere in the EA ecosystem in 2020, the Lead Exposure Elimination Project, or LEAP, was incubated by charity entrepreneurship. They received OpenPhil funding in 2022, and by 2023, a follow-up study on their early work in Malawi had demonstrated a significant reduction in the availability of lead paint. Building on this success, charity entrepreneurship incubated another lead research-focused organization this year, Lead Research. And in parallel, a 2021 research report from Rethink Priorities, commissioned by Open Philanthropy, estimated that the social costs of lead exposure globally are on a scale of $5 to $10 trillion per year, most of which comes through neurological damage to children. This foundational research would then help catalyze action later in 2023 when Open Phil launched a program on lead exposure. Then, this September, Open Philanthropy announced LEAF, the Lead Exposure Action Fund, which will co-fund the Partnership for a Lead-Free Future. The fund is a collaboration with other funders, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and this represents a new phase on the journey. It's an example of experimentation, with this being Open Phil's first collaborative fund, and the power of building a bigger coalition. The fund plans to allocate over $100 million between now and 2027, a dramatic increase over the $15 million per year of philanthropic funding that has existed in the lead reduction space until recently. The work will then continue to build on what others in the EA community and elsewhere have accomplished before, with LEAF funding organizations like LEAP and Pure Earth, as well as others like the Center for Global Development and Palais India Foundation. And, of course, behind each of these organizations are so many other people, many of whom are part of our community, from the staff who set up processes to research and incubate charities at Charity Entrepreneurship, to individuals who donated to GiveWell and EA funds, to the community builders who helped motivate people to work on pressing issues like lead. James Snowden, who is one of the lead grant makers for LEAF and who also made lead-related grants at both GiveWell and Open Philanthropy, told me that, quote, the Effective Altruism community played a crucial role in the partnership coming together. This is how lasting change happens. We didn't discover the dangers of lead exposure, but we had patient, persistent work that shone a spotlight on one of the world's most pressing problems and inspired others to act, up to and including motivating some of the world's most powerful actors and institutions. Building an EA with enduring impact isn't about any one moment in the spotlight. It's about the community of organizations and individuals, many of whom work tirelessly away from any stage, but are inspired by shared principles to show up day after day, year after year. And I think that looking at our history shows us that there are three important ingredients to enhance our impact. First, we need the grit to stay the course, especially when progress seems slow. Second, we need the humility to be able to learn together, particularly when we face our setbacks. And third, we need the courage to share our stories with the world. And so I want to walk through how each of these elements can help us build a stronger, more impactful community. And we'll begin with chickens. The story of corporate cage-free campaigns shows what sustained commitment can achieve. People have been working on these issues since before EA existed, but the EA community has played an important role in recognizing the importance, neglectedness, and tractability of the cause, and dramatically increased the attention and resources we've been able to deploy that have had a role in remarkable recent successes. The Open Wing Alliance reported that earlier this year, 89% of corporate cage-free commitments with deadlines of 2023 or earlier have been fulfilled. But the history of that number is more complicated. Look at this graph. It tells a story about what it really takes to create lasting change. It took a decade of hard work with pretty little reward before success would start to spiral upward. But a snowball effect was set off a little before 2015, with enough major retailers and restaurant chains making commitments that others were then pressured to follow. Where EA and our allies have led, companies like McDonald's have finally followed. This year, advocates achieved a landmark victory when McDonald's announced that 100% of their US eggs are now cage-free. Implementation of over 1,200 commitments like this means that hundreds of millions of hens are now cage-free, suffering less, and living better lives. But building lasting change doesn't mean resting on our laurels. McDonald's are not yet the heroes of the story. It's been considerably more difficult to extend the success of cage-free campaigns for egg-laying hens to comparable commitments to improve the welfare of broiler chickens raised for meat. McDonald's publicly holding out against committing what's known as the Better Chicken Commitment has been a major obstacle. And McDonald's hasn't been the only one slow to act. The UK and Germany have relatively high cage-free rates of over 70% in the UK and 95% in Germany. But in 2022, barely any major retailers in either country had committed to the major components of the Better Chicken Commitment for broilers, which include things like reducing overcrowding and raising slower growing breeds. But then something remarkable happened. The same pattern of persistent effort leading to breakthroughs began to repeat itself. And in 2023, 6 of the UK's top retailers committed to reducing overcrowding. And this year, top German retailers committed to slower growing breeds. Together, these efforts will impact over 400 million chickens per year. That is what building lasting change looks like. If you walk away, the opportunity to iterate, improve, increase impact is lost. But advocates knew that if they stopped, the problem of animal suffering wouldn't walk away with them. Each person who stayed, committed to this cause, was making a choice that their principles and the welfare of millions of chickens mattered more than temporary setbacks. This is what we mean by grit. Critically, though, grit is something that animal advocates have demonstrated not only in failure, but also in success. They have to, because campaigns are oftentimes a two-step process. There's first, where campaigners have to succeed in getting corporations to agree to commitments. But then there's a second phase of implementation that happens afterwards. Even after initial success, they have to keep working. Corporations won't just make good on their commitments on their own. That longer-term perspective is crucial to the type of change that EA has the potential to enact. EA is a young movement, and older ones have seen many ups and downs. But for many people who have only engaged with EA for a short period of time, it can seem like all we know is either success or failure. I remember at the height of FTX's popularity that many people acted as if EA had found an infinite money well and that we would never need to raise money ever again. Then you could talk to some of those same people a month later, and it seemed as if EA was terminally over. Well, I believe it's a strength of many people in this community to update in the face of new information. I also worry that sometimes that can make us too narrow, seeing only the present trends, neglecting the possibility for both lessons from the past and different futures ahead. Building an EA that lasts means taking the long view. A lesson we can all learn from animal welfare advocates is that grit across time is a key component of impact. Sometimes, no matter the ups and downs, it's worth standing by our principles and staying the course. But grit alone isn't enough. Being willing to act under uncertainty and take appropriate risk is a core part of the EA ethos. It's oftentimes formalized with approaches like open philanthropy's hit-based giving. That means that sometimes we will fail. But failure doesn't have to be the end. Failure represents an opportunity to learn from our setbacks and share those lessons with others. Part of what I think is so unique and inspiring about EA is that it isn't just an approach to doing good, but also a community that helps others on their own journey. When we face setbacks, whether in animal welfare campaigns or in our own institutions, we have a choice. We can stay defeated by the difficulties, or we can choose to learn from our failures and help the community as a whole as we learn and improve. Let's take a look at what that looks like in practice. Take the Center for Effective Aid Policy and their forum post from this July. Imagine sitting down to write about a project you poured your heart into that didn't work out and was shut down. Now, imagine writing about that with such clarity and insight that it becomes the highest karma post of the year on the forum thus far. In the post, co-founder Matthias Kirkbonde details a variety of lessons learned, such as the amount of competition around influencing aid dollars, the importance of experience, and the difficulty in finding political champions. I think it takes an incredible amount of humility and courage and altruism to take the time to write up your personal failures and to share them online for anyone to see and comment on. And I think it takes a special community to respond to that with kindness, curiosity, and celebration. EA is in a phase now where learning by doing is becoming even more important. There's still a lot of valuable work being done, figuring things out from first principles, discussing ideas online, conducting randomized control trials to figure out the highest impact interventions to scale. But more of our projects now require us to act in more complex environments with unpredictable counterparts, whether we're trying to influence policy in the near term, like the Center for Aid Policy, or Effective Aid Policy, or LEAP, or working to reduce the likelihood of catastrophic risks in the longer term future. Having an impact in these domains requires us to take action with less confidence in advance about what will work. That means that setbacks aren't just inevitable, they're essential for growth. I think we should be suspicious of an EA that never fails, as an EA that isn't ambitious enough. We're not here to look good, we're here to do good. And oftentimes that means by doing and learning from failure. The trick, then, is to fail well, to have a clear hypothesis for impact, to robustly test that hypothesis with a good faith attempt, and then, if and when we do fail, to do our best to understand why, and to help us and others learn from it. Speaking of learning from setbacks, it's November, and so it's time for our annual reminder about controversies involving men named Sam. It's been 2 years since FTX collapsed. And during that time, setbacks and shortcomings have been especially prominent in many of our minds. 2 years ago, if we had only looked at what was right in front of us, it might have seemed like the end of EA was nigh. And while many in the EA community were victimized by Sam Bankman-Fried's fraudulent behavior, I also think that the crisis that followed exposed broader issues and weaknesses in EA and its institutions. The EA community made mistakes, both before and after the collapse of FTX, that made us less resilient than we could have been. But the measure of a movement isn't just whether it faces crises, it's how it responds to them. From our vantage point of 2 years later, at a global EA conference with over 700 attendees, we can see that we're far from any end. We experienced failure, but we also faced up to it and found opportunities to learn and improve. On the EA forum alone, community members have written dozens of posts about FTX and the lessons we ought to learn from it. I don't think there is or will ever be a consensus on what went wrong or the proper response from the community. But regardless of the answers each individual comes to, I think there's something of value about a community that stares failures in the face, and then instead of running away from its mission, instead asks how it can learn and grow. Some of the learnings I know best are from my experience stepping in as the interim CEO of Effective Ventures in the aftermath of FTX's collapse. For those of you who are unfamiliar with EV, it's a set of umbrella institutions that historically provided incubation, fiscal sponsorship, and operational support to many impactful EA organizations, including 80,000 Hours, Giving What We Can, and the Center for Effective Altruism. It was an institutional cornerstone of the EA community. And EV has a history of both being incredibly impactful and also incredibly flawed. These flaws included the fun feature of having not one, not two, but 3 different organizations called the Center for Effective Altruism at the same time. If any of that sounds confusing, you can do some light reading with my recent 56-minute, 34-page forum post. Just a quick breeze. But the key thing to know now about EV is that it received funding from FTX, and while nobody at EV knew about the fraud, FTX's collapse put a significant strain on EV's financial and operational infrastructure. It shone a spotlight on many of EV's shortcomings, including insufficient staffing, inadequate financial expertise, and conflicts of interest policies of questionable thoroughness. These issues were among the reasons we decided to shut EV down and spin out its various projects. But what matters isn't just what went wrong. It's also how we responded as a community. Consider, I'd estimate that over 50 people meaningfully contributed to reforming EV's governance and operations. Even though EV was shutting down, remaining functional was an essential task to support our projects until they could become independent. Oftentimes, this came at significant personal cost, like volunteers who worked as board members or consultants, or employees with minimal job security given EV's impending wind down. Nonetheless, people took these opportunities because they knew they could help others. Many of these people embodies what it looks like to have a community built on the principles of altruism. But they didn't just stop at fixing what was broken. They contributed to not only implementing changes, but also helping others learn from the mistakes of the past. While my name is on this forum post about sharing reflections, over a dozen people took part and contributed to writing, refining lessons learned from EV's history. Internally, EV's operations team took the time to write up and advise many of the now and soon to be independent projects on how they could set themselves up for governance and operational success, even when they themselves would no longer be involved in the organization's day-to-day affairs. By making the process of learning communal, the team was able to magnify growth that came out of pain. And others have contributed to paying it forward. Projects that were once part of EV have gone out of their way to share their own lessons learned, such as Longview, which used to be a part of EV and generously took the time to write up advice for other organizations looking to become independent based on their own lessons learned as they spun out of Effective Ventures. Even during the process of implementing reforms, I don't think we got everything right. But I do think that the process of learning from those mistakes was something special about EA. The way we can learn as a community. We don't just weather storms, we use them to build stronger foundations for the future. And that brings me to my third and final point for building lasting change. Looking at the examples I've shared from lead elimination to chickens to institutional reform, a pattern emerges, which is that at some point we have to open ourselves up and to communicate with others in the community and the wider world. Building a movement that lasts isn't just about what we do. It's about inspiring others to join us. And we have a lot of work to do there. Despite both the scandals and the success that we've experienced in recent years, the reality is that very few people actually know who we are, what we care about, or the work we do. A study conducted by Rethink Priorities at the end of 2023 showed that the overwhelming majority of Americans still don't know about EA. By most realistic standards, that permissive and stringent ones labeled on the chart, it appears that somewhere in the range of 1% to 3% of American adults are familiar with EA. If 97% of American adults haven't heard of EA yet, that means we have about 250 million attempts to make a good first impression. Part of why we're still so unknown is that the EA community has historically underinvested in communicating our own stories. But I think it's time for that to change. I'm often struck with an interesting tension in the EA community. Here's a group of people who care deeply about working on some of the world's most critical problems. And they believe that others in the world aren't dedicating enough in the way of their own time and resources to addressing those problems. And yet, we're often so hesitant to promote our own principles and our own work. Yet, progress in lead elimination and welfare commitments demonstrate that when we do take the time and put in the effort to share our stories effectively, we can inspire others to act and work alongside us. That's part of the reason why organizations like CEA and Open Philanthropy have taken this year to invest more heavily in their communications infrastructure. And CEA is excited to build foundations that can help this community communicate the good that it does. But building a lasting movement isn't just about institutional communication. It's also in your hands. Everyone in this room has the power to spread the ideas that they care about and to magnify their impact, as we know from data about why people take the 10% pledge. Giving What We Can tracks the primary source cited by people who do take the pledge to donate 10% of their income to the organizations that can use it most effectively. And in 2023, 43% of pledges came from people who were inspired to pledge, either by people they knew or an EA group they participated in. That's part of why I took the pledge earlier this year. For years, I've cared about the principles of effective altruism and participated in effective giving. But I realized that by not signing the pledge, I was missing an opportunity to make those principles legible to others. Building lasting change means making our commitments visible. Signing helps to magnify the voice, not just of me, but of a community and a set of principles that I care about. It helps inform and inspire others so they can participate as well. And in that spirit, I encourage that any of you who are considering the pledge or curious about learning more to go visit Giving What We Can in their booth during EAG. They'll be in the hallway outside of this room during the conference near room 301, where you can learn more about the pledge and also learn about the trial pledge if you aren't yet ready to take the 10% pledge. And if you've already taken the pledge, you can consider talking with others in your life about how they can give effectively during this end-of-year giving season. Think of it this way. Person-to-person communication is so powerful that it has somehow convinced thousands of people to give away 10% of their income for the rest of their lives in exchange for a tiny little pin. There will soon be 10,000 people who have taken the 10% pledge. And when that 10,000th person takes the pledge, it won't just be a number. It will also be a milestone in building a movement that lasts. A celebration of 15 years of Giving What We Can as an organization, and individuals around the world putting principles into practice. And it doesn't have to stop at a pledge. Every person in this room has heard of effective altruism. You all heard about it somewhere, and you probably had a good impression of it if you all wound up here. Think about what brought you to this room, and how you can pass along that same positive energy to others. Talk about your giving, what you work on, what you're reading. Talk about these ideas and the values and how they've changed your life. Building an EA that lasts requires us to have the grit to look beyond any single moment of triumph or setback. It comes from a community that can grow and learn together. It comes not just from living according to our principles, but communicating them, recognizing that the actions we take have the opportunity to inspire others. I believe in EA, both the principles and the community. I believe effective altruism has been a beacon for thousands of people to do more good in the world. And I believe that EA can continue to be a beacon for thousands more. I believe that for those thousands of people acting on those principles can have a tremendous impact on the trajectory of humanity's moral future. Effective altruism has been around for a little over a decade, and looking at what we've already built, I think we can create even more lasting change. I believe that in the next decade, we can eliminate lead paint in dozens of the world's most populous countries and prevent millions of young people from being poisoned. I believe in the next decade, corporate cage-free commitments can become ubiquitous across high-income countries. The majority of not only egg-laying hens, but also broiler chickens in those countries can be freed from the worst forms of suffering. And new campaign organizations can be established in every high-population, lower and middle-income country. I believe in the next decade, we can make 10% pledges widely known and understood by the public, especially here in the US, and we can communicate about effective giving in a way that causes many other prominent public figures, actors, politicians, athletes, to agree with us on the merits, to want to associate themselves with EA, and to take and promote the pledge. I'm here, and you're here, because we want to dedicate ourselves to solving the world's most pressing problems. And we should know that by their nature, signing up to address them isn't going to be easy. But building lasting change doesn't have to be a solitary endeavor. Part of the value of being in this community is that we don't have to do it alone. Together, we can work through challenges. Together, we can learn from our past. And together, we can grow to have an even greater impact in the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Zach, for that talk. And just as a reminder for everybody in the audience, you can submit your questions for Zach for this Q&A section in the event on SwapCard. And you can also upvote questions that you're interested to hear. The first question that I'm going to ask is, what do you think are the biggest barriers to building effective coalitions outside of EA?
Yeah, so My first part of this answer is going to sound a little tongue-in-cheek, but I also mean it seriously. And my answer is try. I just think that for most of EA's history, it's been pretty inwardly focused and hasn't really done the kind of thing that I talked about earlier. Partnering with organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, like LEAP, as OpenPhil has done. And I think part of that comes from a somewhat understandable place, right? So, EA is a young movement in many ways, and in those early days, part of why I wasn't building a coalition is, well, it didn't have anything to build a coalition with. What was EA's value add back then, right? Think back to the early days of GiveWell before we had, identified things like bed nets, before we had identified lead as something that deserved to be elevated to the rest of the world. And a lot of the time was spent on foundational work, like research, like experimentation, incubating charities. And I think we've just moved to another phase of our growth and our journey. And I think we have the capacity to go and move on and build those coalitions. But I think that requires us to try to be able to do those. I think more broadly than that, though, there is also a skill to be had in going and figuring out how to talk to a language that is not necessarily the same language as we would all use on the EA forum, right? And I think part of that can be with people like, you all in this room, going out and talking to other people at other organizations and institutions and learning, what their needs are and where there are places of overlap, even if they don't fit, the exact same profile, following the exact same principles, but recognizing that we are oftentimes trying to mobilize against the same causes and trying to achieve the same ends in the world. But also I think that means valuing different kinds of people who have different kinds of experience from life. Maybe that means not just focusing on young people coming out of universities, but also talking with people who have networks that are built up in these coalitions, that come from these other institutions, that come from government and other places, and valuing and recognizing their experience and the sort of networks they can bring to EA.
Yeah. A bit related to this, I think your last point there is, what are ways that the EA community could concretely get better at telling our own story, maybe especially with those external audiences?
Again, my first tongue-in-cheek answer is, but also true, is try. And I say that in multiple senses of the don't be shy about it. Go out there. There's also been this, experience that I've had in talking to some people, some of whom are communications professionals who know significantly more than I do in the space, where it sometimes feels like they're asking for permission to go and to try things out and to learn things. And I do want to say, I think there is a good version of this. I think particularly for people who are newer to some EA spaces, if they don't have full context, going and touching base, reaching out to Emma, who we have here as a communications lead at CEA, and running ideas past each other to get context and to get potential watch-outs and pitfalls that you might fall into if you're not familiar with it. But I'm excited to see people do a lot more experimentation to see what works. I'm excited for that to happen both from people who don't professionally do communications as part of their background, but going and work on exciting projects that are changing the world and figuring out how to communicate that to others, as well as people who are newer to EA spaces but have more of that professional communications background and can sort of help uplift all of us and teach us what we've been missing there.
Yeah. Let's see. So another heavily upvoted question. What would it look like for EA to over-optimize for its own growth versus collaborating with others, improving the world? Is a focus on the giving pledge and spreading the ideas a warning sign for that? I think they mean is the focus on the giving pledge and spreading ideas about the giving pledge a warning sign of EA over-optimizing for growth. I think that's the implication.
Cool. I will try and answer the question as it is formulated in my mind then as a result of that. Yeah, and so look, I think stepping back and just thinking about growth in general, I think the EA movement should be much larger than it is today. I think that these principles have the power to resonate with a lot more than it's not even 1% of the American public that's resonating with, 1% of the American public that's even heard of EA in the first place. And so I think there is a lot of room to grow in ways that are honest and genuine and authentic to what we do, and to motivate people who would be motivated by these ideas if they had any idea what these ideas were in the sort of first place. I do think that there are ways that we could over-optimize for that. I think in particular, if we started advocating for things because we wanted to be popular, and in a way that, particularly in a way that watered down what our impact was or actual beliefs, or worse than watering down, contradicted them, I think that could be a potentially harmful thing, and I think that could dilute the impact of our community. And, I am on record as having said before, look, like EA, one of the things that the principles that we use for prioritization is the idea of neglectedness. And if you're looking at neglected causes, well, there's probably a reason why the rest of the world isn't focused on those same causes already. And if that's the case, we're probably always going to be having some level of friction with the rest of the world. And I think there is a litmus test for us where I think if we ever reach a point where nobody is bouncing off of EA, we're probably doing something wrong. But at the same time, I think we can and should get bigger. And then I think there was specifically this question about, like, is the pledge part of that? Well, I'm like, well, I think that's going to depend upon you all and your individual views on this pledge. And EA is a diverse community. I mean, people can look at the same set of principles and be motivated to do different things. I think the argument for the pledge being, if I'm trying to steel man that argument, I think the argument for the pledge being something that is a bad form of growth. One of the arguments would just be if money isn't that valuable, or it's just significantly less valuable than people focusing on careers, and that maybe just donations are not, in fact, the thing that is an important bottleneck for us doing more good in the world. And I think if that were the case, and you were just trying to get more people to give more money to get them into EA, then yeah, that would not be a good thing, because at the end of the day, EA isn't in it for EA. EA is in it for the good of the world, and that is the actual thing that we should be keeping our eye on. With that being said, I just personally don't think that that's the position we're in. I actually think we can benefit from both a greater quantity of funding and a much greater diversity of funding. And so I'm very enthusiastic to spread the pledge.
Relatedly, I mean, I think you touch on, maybe a potential objection to, trying to push the pledge. Somebody asked, what do you think is the best objection to taking the 10% pledge in general?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that the one I just mentioned on sort of a macro scale is potentially one. I think there are, other objections that can be particular to people's circumstances. I think one that probably applies to actually disproportionately people in EA spaces is that oftentimes people who have made changes in their career for the sake of impact have taken much more than a 10% cut relative to the counterfactual jobs that they would otherwise potentially be doing. And so then asking them to give another 10% on top of that, it isn't just a 10% cut, right? It's significantly more for the sake of these principles that we follow. I also think that there can be concerns around specific populations. And so I think, for example, there's been a lot of discussion and debate around how to engage students on campuses around this, where I think it is somewhat understandable to have a certain level of caution around students who don't actually know in many cases what it means to have a job and to be in charge of their household's finances and things along those lines, and yet we're asking them to give away 10% of their income for the rest of their life. And I think that can be a little bit odd. And people can I don't know if unsign or whatever, break the pledge, it is an option, but that's a hard thing to do emotionally and psychologically for a lot of people. And so I think that is a potential concern. I think that things like the trial pledge, which does have more flexibility associated with it, both in terms of duration and in terms of amount giving, is something that I'm really appreciative of giving what we can, innovating, and using that as a potential bridge to help explore what effective giving can look like for people who are genuinely enthusiastic about it, but may not be at the right point in their lives right now to make that lifelong commitment.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all we have time for now, but thank you all so much for joining us. And if you want to talk to Zach more, you had other questions, you can join us for office hours in room 303.
Thank you so much, Emma, and thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it.